Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 19th of September 2016. We're now 1:15. We've had some technical problems. Apologies for that, but happy to say everything seems to be working well. Well done, Mike. Well, because we've lost some time, we'll move straight on to the key part of our news today, and that's an update on events that took place over the weekend when US forces bombed Syrian government forces on the ground. That took place, we believe, late afternoon on Saturday. And we've got Vanessa Beeley to join us live by video Skype link to take us through what's happened.
So Vanessa, we'll just start off with this Iranian report here. Leaked source reveals coordination between US, ISIS in attacking Syrian army, and it begins by saying the ISIS launched attacks on the Syrian army positions in Dier, only 7 minutes after the US led coalition's airstrikes on Saturday. Really, the response from the Syrian government, and particularly from the Russians, has been pretty strong. This is Maria Sarakova, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, and she was saying, if previously we had any suspicions that the al-Nusra front is protected this way, now after today's airstrikes on the Syrian army, we come to a really terrifying conclusion for the entire world. The White House is defending Islamic State. And of course, it wasn't just the United States, because it was also Australia. And we have a report here from Danish press. The 2 Danish F-16s were involved in this bombing of the Syrian military. Now, as I understand it, it was around 60 soldiers killed in a pretty sustained bombing campaign.
Yeah, 62, I think, and over 100 injured. In fact, probably the death toll will increase. And firstly, publicly, I'd like to express very deep condolences to the families of those soldiers who died as members of the Syrian National Army, as brothers, sons, fathers of families inside Syria, and died defending their homeland. And that is something that has not been expressed by the United States that slaughtered these soldiers, these Syrian people. And, you know, if this were to happen on American soil, imagine if another global power attacked America and slaughtered 62 American soldiers on their own soil and injured a further 100. Can you imagine the reaction that would come through from the United States over that?
The discussion that, sorry, Vanessa, we're getting quite a bit of feedback from your computer there. If you have some headphones, yes, please. So anyway, the response from the Syrian government was quite clear, and from the Russian government, that the United States, UK, supporting ISIS from the beginning. And that's the first, to my knowledge, that's the first public statement from the Russians in particular, a direct accusation that we are directly sponsoring Islamic terrorism in Syria.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this has been investigated, documented over time in any case. When we've seen that, in fact, when the Americans ostensibly started bombing ISIS in Syria in 2014, all we saw in reality was the expansion of ISIS. We didn't see the diminishment of the areas that they were embedded in or were occupying. We saw an expansion of it. We also received reports throughout the US bombing campaign, from Iraq in particular, of the United States dropping supplies, food, weapons to the ISIS operatives. We saw them pass 500 miles across desert and yet not have the convoy bombed by the United States. And then what highlighted their hypocrisy was Russia entering into the fray in September 2015, and we then started to see the destruction of ISIS.
Absolutely. So, look, what did the Syrian soldiers have to say?
Well, video came in yesterday. It was one of the first interviews of the soldiers who obviously were there and witnessed this attack. They first of all said, we first thought that the aircraft are supporting us after the first 2 shots, but we quickly realized that they're targeting our forces, the Syrian Arab Army forces, aggressively while we were fighting and battling against ISIS terrorists. So in the midst of a battle, the United States coalition started to bomb the Syrian Arab Army. There are claims from these soldiers in that video that the aircraft used cluster bombs against them. They also note that a day before the airstrikes, the American drones were flying low around the area and scanning the area. The US airstrikes, they're saying, destroyed all our equipment and defense points in the area that had been set up to basically in the fight against the ISIS terrorists that have, by the way, besieged and occupied Deir ez-Sur for many years now, starved the civilians and starved these Syrian Arab Army soldiers that were fighting there. The ISIS fighters attacked them immediately after the US attacks, after the US airstrikes. And there are even reports from some of the soldiers in that video that they were laughing at the Syrian Arab Army soldiers as they came into attack. They then also say that the US drones and helicopters opened fire, particularly with machine guns, on the retreating Syrian Arab Army forces. So they not only bombed the Syrian Arab Army, they then fired on them as they were trying to retreat from the airstrikes. Most of the soldiers on there are saying it for sure was not a mistake. They targeted us intentionally. And then I think one of the soldiers is actually seen saying, America is ISIS itself. We also need to remember, and this is, I don't think this is in the video, the translation was given to me by somebody that very kindly and very quickly did it for me last night. We also were told that the attack lasted over an hour. You know, this is not a mistaken airstrike. The US has in its arsenal some of the most sophisticated surveillance equipment on the planet. It's perfectly capable, particularly if it had been surveying the area. And by the way, it's Israeli drones that are often used to survey these areas. They would have been perfectly aware of the movements of the Syrian Arab Army compared to the movements of ISIS. They attacked in the midst of a battle. They attacked to give cover to ISIS, which then occupied the area that had just been bombed. I believe it's now been retaken by the Syrian Arab Army. But this is a clear indication of the US blatant aggression against a sovereign nation. And if we go back to the Nuremberg rulings, to initiate a war of aggression is not only an international crime, it's the supreme international crime. And so America is proving itself time and time again to, one, be allied with terrorism, the very terrorism that is supposedly the one that they're waging the war of terror against, and the one that is executing terrorist attacks inside Europe. And they are also blatantly violating international law, any sort of humanitarian law, and any kind of moral law. As Neil Clark said today, the US is aiding the terror groups that launched attacks in Europe. In a sane world, the EU should be sanctioning the US, not Russia. I mean, this is, you know, this attack is just, it's such a blatant demonstration of the lawlessness and the criminality of the US regime that is, they are the ones that are butchering entire societies and cultures around this world.
Well, okay, so just, sorry, did you want to ask?
Yeah, just if I can just add a bit, Vanessa, I couldn't agree more. There's no way that an attack like this would be accidental. If you're using drones for surveillance, I'm sure that the Americans would have had forward observers. There's nothing beats people on the ground in order to help coordinate airstrikes. You've got different aircraft being used. And I wasn't aware of the helicopters, but if you also had helicopters operating, then this was an extremely well-planned operation. And the next bit we can say, of course, that we've had both the US and Britain boasting of the accuracy of their weapons. So it can't be that we were firing missiles or dropping guided bombs and they were falling astray. This was clearly targeted and would have required some quite comprehensive planning. So I would just like to say from my own military experience, albeit many years ago now, but there is no way that this scale of operation could be a simple mistake.
No, and just to give you a very, very quick example, when I was in Syria recently and I was talking with the Grand Mufti Hassoun, and he told us of a visit that he had made to Dier, a suburb of Damascus, and he was actually going on an amnesty, on a reconciliation mission. He was taking fighters back to Dier to be reunited with their family. That entire operation, if you like, that he was carrying out on behalf of the Ministry of Reconciliation was being surveyed by Israeli drones. When they arrived, they were bombed, they were shelled by the terrorist enclaves, and they actually killed their own fighters in the process. They lobbed mortars at the reconciliation team, and they killed quite a few, including their own fighters that had been brought back to the area. That was heavily investigated, and it was discovered that it was Israeli surveillance drones that had pinpointed their positions and then fed them back to the terrorists. So we can only assume that this kind of intelligence was being passed from ISIS to the United States prior to this mission, as you quite rightly say, because there's no better information than from on the ground.
So before we move on to why this might have happened, what's your take on where this leaves a ceasefire? And I mean, what as far as Syrian people are concerned, what does this ceasefire represent anyway?
To be honest, for the majority of the Syrian people, the ceasefire is a huge source of frustration, because these ceasefires invariably, as they were, I think, in February and May, are enforced just as the Syrian army are usually making huge advances, as they are currently in Aleppo. And so for the Syrian people, actually, there's generally a feeling of frustration and realization that their own army's advances are going to be, to some extent, impeded, and that there is a high risk of replenishment of weapons and supplies to the terrorist forces, as we're actually just seeing in Aleppo, where the West is portraying it as the Syrian government is preventing humanitarian aid getting into the eastern terrorist-held areas of Aleppo, whereas in fact, it's very possible that those lorries that are not UN, by the way, they're IHH, which is a known ally to the terrorist factions, may well be stuffed full of arms and equipment and supplies for those terrorists. So the Syrian government has every right to hold back on any sort of pseudo or suspect humanitarian aid that has been proven in the past. Serena Shim was killed for proving that the WHO was bringing weapons and terrorists into Syria. So this is not some newfangled theory. This has been going on for 5.5 years.
Okay, well, let's bring up a map then, because, of course, this attack took place round about Deir ez-Zor, which you can see there to the east of Syria. And you wanted to highlight this key fact here, that there are two competing pipelines for gas, one sponsored by the Russians, which runs from Iran through Deir ez-Zor and to the Syrian coast for sending gas to Europe, and one from Qatar and heading just through Jordan and through Saudi, through Jordan and up into Turkey. And of course, your suspicion is that it's this that caused them to attack Deir ez-Zor in particular?
Absolutely. If you look at these pipelines, as you rightly say, the Russian-backed pipeline will pass directly through not only Deir ez-Zor, but also very close to Raqqa, which maybe explains why the US had occupied Raqqa via their ISIS proxies. The attack on Deir ez-Zor to me, it's a very clear attempt to derail the Russian interests inside Syria. And if you equally go back to the Qatar-Turkey pipeline, of course, guess where that passes through? Aleppo, Al-Bab, Manbij, Idlib, all the areas that are being hotly contested by Turkey, the Gulf states, America, and its NATO allies. So where was America bombing with the support of ISIS? In Manbij. They claimed they were bombing ISIS, and yet they were seen to literally escort ISIS safely out of Syria under the pretext of ISIS had hostages with them, so they needed to give them safe, unimpeded passage out of Syria. The sheer farce of their explanation of what they are doing in Syria is monumental.
And the other thing which is hardly being mentioned in the Western media, of course, it has been mentioned, but it's not getting any great detail, is the fact that Turkey has in fact invaded Syria at the moment. And if we just bring the map of Syria back up again and ring the area, which is just to the west of the Euphrates, it's this is the main pipeline for bringing terrorists into the country, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's not only that, Mike. What we also have to look at, there's a report actually that just came out. Give me 2 seconds. What they're actually, if you look at where they're actually talking about extending, they're talking about extending this annexation, this annexed zone to 5,000 square kilometers, which is actually huge. So they're talking about going down south from where they are, and guess where? Into the Al-Bab region, into the northern region of Aleppo. So again, this is blatantly, it has a multi-layered agenda. One is to protect the Qatari pipeline, because the region that they're talking about annexing directly protects that transportation, that proposed transportation line for the gas and oil, by the way. It's not only gas. And then, of course, we're hearing that Turkey is now supplying electricity to these northern sectors of Syria, and they're taking payment for that electricity in Turkish currency. Apparently also Syrians in that area have been offered Turkish citizenship. The police force in that area have been reported to be changing their uniform to a Turkish uniform. So we're seeing a stealth annexation and occupation of Syrian territory from the north, and we're also seeing Israel encroaching more and more into the Golan Heights. So we're seeing a pincer action from NATO and US allies inside Syria to secure territory and to basically to combat a pincer mission into Syria.
So it's interesting you use the word annex. How come when there are allegations of annexation by Russia in the Ukraine, and that results in the most serious condemnation globally for Russia, how come there's no condemnation of Turkey in this?
Mike, how come there is no condemnation of the mass incarceration of dissidents and academics and intellectuals inside Turkey? I think over 80,000 so far have been arrested. How come there is no condemnation of the conversion of Turkey from a secular state into an Islamist state, where now even female police commissioners are being told by law they have to wear the veil, they have to wear the hijab? How come there is no condemnation of the abuse and torture in the prisons of those intellectuals and dissidents and media that dare to speak out against the government? How come there is no condemnation of the mass slaughter of an ethnic cleansing of the Kurdish minorities inside Turkey? You know, this is glaring hypocrisy from the NATO and the US, as if we should expect anything more from them. But it's absolute insanity. Syria, that has never invaded a country outside of its own borders, is being demonized and vilified to an extent that has really actually never been witnessed before, because they've simply resisted for over 5.5 years. So the propaganda has become so enormous to try and bring them down, and it's failing. And yet we see, as you quite rightly say, Turkey behaving like a complete despot, without any brakes being put upon their murderous and illegal and violating of international law actions.
Okay, well, let's just talk a little bit about the propaganda, because this has got to be the most obscene example of it. Channel 4 News to many people's minds, Channel 4 News used to be, going back a few years now, used to be one of the more reasonable mainstream news channels. And in the last couple of years in particular, it is getting worse and worse. And I mean, it is really, really easy to get pretty motivated about this particular interview. But there are other examples. But Cathy Newman here really was a disgrace, was she not?
Oh, I mean, honestly, if she could time travel, she could go back and apply as a job as personal assistant to Goebbels. I mean, this was the most extraordinary display of mockingbird journalism, you know, completely working in lockstep with the state propaganda producers and attacking and haranguing and interrogating, grilling one of the most senior representatives of a sovereign nation. I mean, it's disgusting. It's absolutely reprehensible.
Right, Theo, just put that one back up again, please. Who is this that she was speaking to?
It's Dr. Butaina Shaban, who is the media and political advisor to the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
And she was pretty clear in her view, in her criticism of the Western mainstream press in response, perhaps pretty unwilling to answer some of the questions, it's fair to say, but at the end of the day, her main point was that the mainstream press are supporting Western governments' in turn support of Islamic terrorists. And her main point was that the majority of what's going on in Syria is as the result of these Western-backed terrorists. But Cathy Newman she was almost shouting at her.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, she regurgitated the majority of the lies that have been completely discredited, even by the CIA. I mean, this is not journalism. This is really, she's just acting as a sort of a high-level PR agency for the state interventionist foreign policy. She's a tool for imperialism, nothing less and nothing more. If she was a decent journalism, she would have investigated every single one of those reports, including, by the way, their own hideous report on the so-called chlorine attacks against Aleppo. What she's palpably ignoring is the fact that Nusra Front took over the only chemical weapons factory in Aleppo in 2012 and have regularly targeted Western Aleppo, 1.5 million civilians in Western Aleppo with chemical weapons. She ignored the fact that the chemical weapon report has been debunked and discredited even by state institutions. She ignored the fact that that Al-Quds Hospital, that they claimed was destroyed earlier this year, suddenly miraculously reappeared in order for them to make the report on the chlorine attacks. Their information comes from the Aleppo Media Center, which, by the way, is a French Foreign Office funded propaganda outlet inside eastern Aleppo, so embedded with Nusra Front. And there are so many disgusting holes in her narrative that this woman should not be allowed to call herself a journalist, and she should certainly not be allowed to publicly harangue and interrogate somebody of the gravitas and the integrity as Dr. Butaina Shaban. And by the way, all of us have actually messaged Cathy Newman and invited her to Syria to come and meet the Syrian people that she insulted in that interview. And she has not yet responded. She has also received many emails from Syrian people that are disgusted by, not only by that interview, but by previous Channel 4 reports that they have accused them of blatantly lying. And none of those emails from the Syrian people have been responded to. So I extend that invitation to Cathy Newman. Come with me to Syria and come and talk to these Syrian people that you have just insulted, because by doing that report, you have allied yourself with ISIS. And to be honest, you might as well go and fight with ISIS and be killing the Syrian people, because what you did there and what you have done with your blatant lies is no different.
Okay, well, that's quite an offer. Somehow I don't think she'll be taking it up, but maybe she'll get some guts or something. Who knows?
Just, Vanessa, if I may, just before we went live, I mentioned that I'd read an article in the Military Times which was saying, quote, the American military were pissed off that they understood that their political masters were going to ask them to expand operations in Syria against al-Nusra. And if this report is to be believed, what the American military were indicating was that this was literally asking them to conduct a massive expansion in their operations in Syria. Now, you came back with some opinions on that. Your feeling at the moment is that this is a total distraction because the al-Nusra has been a key part of the terrorist organization from the beginning. So this can't be true, is essentially what you're saying. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I've just spent 4 weeks inside Syria, and I've spoken extensively with people across all the governorates of Syria. And when I actually try, because I'm researching for a particular article or a story, or I'm following something up, when I try to differentiate which terrorist group has carried out which heinous crime, the majority of the time I've actually been met with real frustration from Syrian people across all walks of life that there is any differentiation between these terrorists, because, as they say, there is no difference. They are all terrorists, they all adhere to the same ideology, and they are all killing us. And so this differentiation between Nusra Front, al-Sham, ISIS, Noor al-Denzenki is another US form of obscurantism, of sort of misinforming the public. And so what I think this is a smokescreen from the military to try and portray the image of them trying to put the brakes onto this operation. But I think were the military really looking to pull back on this entire operation in Syria, they would not have escalated it by bombing the national army on Saturday. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. So for me, this is actually a sort of another creep mission to increase the militarism inside Syria. And that is what has to be absolutely prevented.
Absolutely.
Okay. So no difference between these terrorist groups, and therefore we can remind our viewers and listeners today that it was Conservative MP Brooks Newmark who was boasting that he'd been meeting General Idris of the Free Syrian Army on the Turkish-Syrian border. What was it, Mike? A couple of years ago, yeah. 2013, and in the reported newspaper articles, Brooks Newmark, Conservative MP at the time, was happily saying, well, of course, they're linked through to al-Nusra, to which we said at the time, so we have a Conservative MP openly boasting of his links through to terrorist organisations. And perhaps the other thing we just better mention is amazing timing that we've just had the American-Israeli arms deal for $38 billion worth of equipment. So presumably the Israelis are being stoked up, resupplied, because the powers that be know that the agenda is to escalate the fighting in Syria.
And Brian, they're simply arming and equipping another terrorist entity, the illegal state of Israel. Again, we've seen. I would almost proffer that there is not a huge amount of difference between Israel and all of these terrorist factions, because in fact, as we've said, we've seen Israel bombing the Golan Heights, and guess what? That's opening the door for the Nusra Front to enter into the areas where they've just bombed. So again, Israel is working in lockstep with the terrorists that, by the way, they take into their hospitals for treatment, that they supply and equip via the borders there. So, this is no great surprise, and you're absolutely right. I would put Israel into the same basket as the terrorists that are being aided and abetted by the United States to carry out this blitzkrieg against Syria. And the FSA started life as a bunch of criminals and felons, smugglers and ex-cons that were funded by Saudi Arabia to start the armed insurgents in Syria. They then realized that apart from carrying out a few incursions and kidnappings, they were not well enough equipped. So they then had to basically merge with Nusra Front in order to bolster their equipment, because Nusra Front were being so well supplied by the NATO member state alliance and the United States. And there is no, again, one of the questions that I asked everybody, are Nusra Front or any of the so-called moderate rebel factions actually fighting ISIS? I was laughed at. I was laughed out of town in virtually every single Syrian governorate that I entered. And they said, are you joking? They said, basically, the only thing they will fight over is money. They're not going to fight each other. They're working together.
Right.
Okay.
Well, we just add this to it because these events have largely been overlooked. But Russia today reporting that there was a US airstrike which had killed a policeman, a follow-up strike which killed 7 others. So this was just part of the report. So the US military said that basically said in Kabul that it did confirm that its planes had carried out an airstrike, but said it was targeting individuals who were firing on or posing a threat to Afghan national forces. So I just thought, well, this is a very sad indictment on the US military, because clearly with all of their high-tech equipment, they apparently have got a problem targeting and who is who. So if that one was incompetence, well, who knows? But let's also remind ourselves of this one, because this is reports in, obviously, UK press that it was our own Prime Minister who was responsible for the growth of ISIS. And this hasn't come out of the statement by one MP, it's come out of the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. They've put in a report that his actions in Libya helped create the growth of ISIS. Now, this is a cock-up rather than conspiracy report, well, in the way that it's analysed it. I think we would say he knew full well what he was doing, but it goes on here. So the policy was an opportunist policy of regime change. Well, we were told that there wasn't regime change, but now this committee has said that it was. And what have we got here? The spread of Gaddafi regime weapons across the region and the growth of Islamic State. So there's no secret if the Russians are now saying that ISIS was created by the West. We've got British media saying, well, David Cameron was one of the key people helping to create that threat.
Yeah. Right. Look, we're going to move on to globalism, Brexit, and a bit of migration. But I'm going to ask for a bit of comment on this, Vanessa, shortly. But before we get into this, I just want to highlight this from Matthew Rycroft, who's the UK ambassador to the United Nations. And he said this yesterday: the last time the world faced a crisis as big as this, with tens of millions displaced, was the Second World War. With that, we took a global approach, a comprehensive approach, and we created the United Nations. So just keep this in mind. This is kind of the agenda that we're seeing at the moment, this idea of a global approach. And I just want to highlight this, and I apologize for anybody that's going to get upset about this. But Nigel Farage, after saying last week that we did it, we got our country back, tweeted out this morning, we're leaving the European Union and going global. It's an exciting new future for our country. So what he is saying here is we're out of one pan-national organization. We'll forget about that because we're going to go bigger and we're going to end up in an even bigger mess than we were with the EU. Because, of course, at the heart of this is the fact that the UK is becoming a global leader in free trade. And we highlighted this a week or two ago. And I'll just remind you once again of the Best of Both Worlds document, which is the document that Cameron published just before the referendum, about the referendum. And the key phrase in that, or the key clause in that, was these include the UK's top trade priority, an agreement between the EU and the US, brackets, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. And we also highlighted last week the fact that Theresa May has said we are going to make a success of Brexit. And one way to do this is by playing on Britain's strengths as a great trading nation and forging our own new trade deals around the world. And so, you know, it is perhaps a little bit ironic that on the weekend and the days after, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Germans are out protesting not only TTIP, but CETA and the other free trade agreements, that in fact what we have in this country is not only Nigel Farage, but his compadres at the Express pushing the idea that we should be absolutely getting behind these free trade agreements. This is an Express headline from this morning. EU plot to sue Britain for striking trade deals with other nations before Brexit. We've got to remember what these trade deals are. These are not arrangements for us passing goods backwards and forwards. Not only that, they are as well this new form of global governance, which we're seeing expressed through TPP, TTIP, TISA, CETA, and a whole bunch of other trade agreements, which Britain has decided that Britain is going to lead the drive for. Nigel Farage is now coming out and saying this is a great thing, and I'm sorry, but that's not quite it. So the PSYOP continues. We are absolutely being played. Our minds are being played with. It's great we're out of Europe is the message that we're getting, but let's go global instead. Okay, so this is pretty unpleasant stuff. But of course, today is the beginning of the United Nations General Assembly. So they have produced a nice little introductory video, and guess what the headline discussion is today? It is the commencement of the first ever UN summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. That's taking place today. So let's remind ourselves of what Matthew Rycroft said. The last time the world faced a crisis as big as this, with tens of millions displaced, it was the Second World War. With that, we took a global approach, a comprehensive approach. We created the United Nations, and the United Nations is now going to decide what's going to happen with millions of displaced. So Theresa May, speaking at the UN today, said with more people are displaced than at any point in modern history, requiring a new, more effective global approach to manage migration. She said, oh, sorry, I apologize, that's an extra one. So the question is, what is this new effective global approach going to be? Well, we don't know exactly what it is yet, but if you remember, one of the things that we've been saying here at the column for a number of years now is that we were not clear whether the path to global governance and global government was going to be through the United Nations or through the Commonwealth. So Theresa May busy saying this, and in the meantime, Baroness Scotland, absolutely by coincidence today of all days, pushing the Commonwealth consensus on the need to respond to irregular mass migration. And she said the Commonwealth will play an important role to ensure this global compact leaves no one behind by identifying specific challenges faced by our member states, especially small nations which represent the majority of our members. And she's talking about global migration and so on. But you notice we're into the language of member states, and it's very EU, and this is being developed as a replacement for the European Union from Britain's point of view, is how I see it. But we're all talking. It's about using migration, it's about using trade and various other things as mechanisms towards global governance.
We give Vanessa a reply there. Vanessa, were you able to follow that okay?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to focus in on this this refugee issue because one of the things that I noted when I was in Syria is comments from people that obviously where areas have been liberated and they're able to return, like for instance Homms. And yet what they've said is that the demographics of many of these regions have been completely destroyed, in the sense that those that have the money, the education, the ability to leave Syria have left Syria. Because basically Homms in particular was being targeted. There's a street there that's been renamed the Street of Death because of the amount of times it was targeted from all directions by the terrorist factions. And what they said was that it's completely changed the demographics of Homms in particular. That the majority of the educated, the academic class, if you like, those with the financial ability to be able to leave have left. And then if we look at what's happening in Europe, and this is a very worrying trend to me, I think it's in Germany, where they're talking about taking the refugees that come in and then creating a military brigade from these refugees that are coming in. Then we see the education projects and initiatives that are being introduced for the refugees. So to me, we're seeing a sort of a very sinister driving out of a certain faction of Syrian society into Europe and into Canada and into the States, a re-education of that faction, a co-opting of that faction into military. Are we then going to see this being turned back upon Syria as another extension of the shadow state, the shadow army, the shadow free police, that has been being created by our government in particular and the United States since the dirty war on Syria began? So to me, these are just thoughts that are coming in my head now. The fact that this refugee crisis is being instrumentalized and weaponized to such an extent is, for me, a frightening development.
Right, so that is a key word, and we've used it in many different areas, many different policy areas. Weaponization of migration, weaponization of migrants, because what is not being discussed at the United Nations this week, and what is not being discussed by the Commonwealth or any of the people commenting on this, is they're all talking about how to solve the problem, but surely the simplest way to solve the problem is to end the war.
Yes, and anyone in Syria will say that. I mean, of the internally displaced people, which are over 7 million, all of them, or 90% plus of them, have gone into the government-held areas. All that is required in Syria, is the lifting of the criminal US-EU sanctions that are crippling the Syrian people via the health and education sectors and other sectors, agricultural sectors, for example, power sectors, electricity, everything is being affected by this. And then simply to get out of Syria and to take your criminal gangs of mass murderers, over 360,000, according to a recent German think tank report, over 360,000 foreign mercenaries inside Syria. Get out of Syria and take these mercenaries out. Do what you want with them, but get them out of Syria and take your terrorist factions and gangs and counter-gangs out of Syria. And then let's see what happens with the refugee crisis. The majority of Syrians would come back, but that's not what they want. Yeah. That's clear that that's not what they want.
Indeed.
Okay, right. Well, Vanessa, truth is obviously a key weapon. We could solve a lot of the problems if we could get to the truth. Well, The Guardian's an interesting, Guardian's an interesting newspaper from that respect. I need some help with this article because I've read it several times. The idea of a post-truth society is elitist and obnoxious. And this lady, Tracy Brown, basically she says people's attraction to the Brexit camp's dodgiest claims is not an invitation to those in authority to abandon truthfulness. So she says, well, it was those nasty Brexit people who came out with all the lies. She very big on it. She was tweeting out, and she said this: 85% of people want politicians to consult experts, like herself, in fact. But we'll come on to that. She says that the trust in experts and confidence in government is increased since a similar Institute for Government poll in 2014, and people who voted Leave and Remain share much the same view. So we all trust our government more. Why can we trust the advisors? Because they're experts. Well, Tracy Brown is an expert herself. I encourage people to go and have a look at her. She's one of the director of Sense About Science. She's got a background in social research. And oh dear, she spent 4 years working on a European Commission programme to establish social research and teaching in the former Soviet Union. So we might assume that she's pro-European Union and hence was against anybody who wanted to come out, which is why she's pointing a finger at them. But ask yourself who this lady is. She was connected with this charity, which is UK Drug Policy Commission. It's not in existence anymore, it's gone, but have a look at who's involved because they're independent. And I spotted quite quickly Sir David Bell, a man who's fiercely independent or not, And of course, when he's not running the political charity Common Purpose influencing government, here he is with Esme Fairbairn, which is an independent charity apart from the banking interests and the political interests and the drug company interests. And Tracy Brown was happy to be part of their help. Sorry, Mike.
Yeah, but let's not forget that Sir David Bell, also Pearson, which is now divested itself of the Financial Times and so on to concentrate on its education business.
They definitely want to educate. And I haven't forgotten, of course, Vanessa, that Common Purpose boasted that it got a lot of European money to go back into destroyed Libya in order to help Libyans reconstruct their government and civil service. But this lady has done more. Sorry, let's bring in this one, because here she is sat at a table with the research community in China. And who is this woman? What gives her this ability to globe trot? And she's working hard to make sure that there's further deals coming with the Chinese.
A globalist agenda at work here, Brian. Absolutely. And let's just end by pointing out that it is a globalist agenda: global tax, global parliament of mayors, global trade, global war. And let's just remind ourselves again, because it's great. Sorry.
Oh,
sorry, I blew it.
Here we
it doesn't matter.
Live. We're going to be able to correct the error live, or are we?
No,
wait a
not.
minute. Just stay with me. Okay, we should be able to bring that up. Not something that you'll see on the BBC, but we had less than 3.65 billion come in last year. That's our excuse. So there he is. We've warned about this man from the very beginning. We said consistently that Nigel Farage would lead the UKIP voters into a dead end, a corral. He's consistently closed down all of the good efforts by the body of the UKIP church. And now we see what this man is really about, which is collapsing all of that support for Britain as a nation state. And now he's moving on with the globalist agenda.
Absolutely. Yes.
Nasty stuff.
So Vanessa, just to end, what's next in Syria?
What's next in Syria? I think now we just have to literally let the dust settle and see what happens. But my fear is that this is the start of a much bigger military operation by America. Whether they disguise it as they now suddenly, after 5.5 years of supporting Nusra Front, they now suddenly have to. And by the way, that's quite interesting that they use the term Nusra Front, because my understanding is that Nusra Front in Syria had actually rebranded itself as Jabhat al-Sham and was no longer Nusra Front to distance itself from al-Qaeda. So is that a bit of a Freudian slip?
No, I think they're just so embarrassed about how many times they tried to change the name of ISIS that they don't want to do it again.
Well, I think they actually can't keep up with their own propaganda now. I think they've just reached such a level and they can't pronounce most of the names anyway. They still call Kata. I mean, it's actually, this is the slightly comedic aspect of this entire farce, very murderous farce. But I mean, we even watched John Kirby the other day, in the State Department, trying to wriggle out of why on earth these terrorists that they've been funding and supporting and equipping and arming had turned around and called them Crusader pigs and told them to get out of Syria. So, this is, one, they're losing control, quite possibly, of their rogue elements on the ground in Syria. But two, you're right. I mean, if they're still adhering to the Nusra Front terminology, then that means they haven't caught up with their own propaganda and the fact that allegedly they've changed names in order to disassociate themselves from al-Qaeda. So they need to make their minds up. Are Nusra Front al-Qaeda or are they not? Are they an enemy or are they not? This is the thing. They're tripping up over their own lies, because actually, I genuinely believe that UK Column and other good independent media channels are really hurting them. And I think we're actually seeing them if you like, falling over their own propaganda right now. And I think it's great. That's actually a very positive aspect of what we're seeing.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for joining us in another excellent update. Just to say that we will be joined by David Ellis tomorrow from Strategic Defence Initiatives. We're having a focus on what's happening in Britain's military. While Britain helps create the wars overseas, our own military capability is being destroyed deliberately. And amongst other matters, we're going to be talking about the confusion over whether China as a communist country is an enemy or indeed it's a friend. Theresa May is confused. We're inviting the Chinese in to help rebuild our nuclear infrastructure, but retired Admiral Boyce still thinks the Chinese are a threat, so he wants Royal Navy warships to join the American fleet in the China Sea. That's if the water isn't too warm and the ships don't work properly. So senior retired military, a little bit confused. They think China's an enemy. Theresa May thinks that they're very friendly, so she wants to invite them into the country. But she has said that there will be special measures put in place in order to vet the Chinese in case they turn out to be less friendly than she thinks they are at the moment. It's a bit similar to what you've just said, Vanessa, to do with al-Nusra, that they're not too sure who's the friendly terrorists and who are the not so nice terrorists. But we got the same problem with China. Accident? Certainly not. This is deliberate. Join us tomorrow and we will take you through that scenario. And before we go, just remind people, Wednesday evening, we'll be having our UK column meeting at the George Hotel, Plimpton. We will be doing a formal presentation. And if you're a newcomer, please come and join us. We will ask for a donation on the door if you feel that's appropriate. So there we are. That's it for today. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.